He thought he was doing me a favor. That was the part that stung the most, not the words he used, not the tone, not even the timing. It was the look on my son-in-law's face when he said it. That calm, almost charitable expression, like he was releasing a stray dog back into the wild and feeling good about himself for it. It was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. My daughter, Renee, was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands, not looking at me. My grandson, Cooper, was upstairs. I could hear his video game through the ceiling. And Derek, my son-in-law of 11 years, was sitting at the head of the dining room table, the table I had bought them as a housewarming gift, leaning back in his chair like a man who had already decided how the conversation was going to end before it began. "Robert," he said, "I think we need to talk about the arrangement." That was the word he used. Arrangement. Like I was a piece of furniture they'd agreed to store temporarily. I had moved in 4 months earlier, after my knee surgery. The recovery had been harder than the doctors predicted, and my house, my real house, the one I'd owned outright for 19 years in Sarasota, was a 2-story that suddenly felt like a mountain. Renee had insisted. She'd called me 3 times in 1 week, said it made no sense for me to be alone, said the guest room was just sitting there, said Cooper would love having his grandfather around. I told her I didn't want to be a burden. She told me not to be ridiculous, so I came. I paid for my own groceries. I cooked dinner twice a week. I took Cooper to school every Tuesday and Thursday, so Renee didn't have to rearrange her work schedule. I fixed the leaking faucet in the second bathroom that Derek had been meaning to get to for 3 months. I was not a burden. I was, by any honest measure, an asset to that household. But Derek had done the math differently. "It's just," he said, spreading his hands in that reasonable way of his, "we're a family unit. And Renee and I feel like we need our space back. For us. For our marriage." I looked at Renee. She was examining the dish towel like it contained the answers to questions she hadn't asked yet. "Your marriage," I repeated. "You've been here almost 5 months, Robert. It was supposed to be a recovery situation. And your knee is fine now. Your doctor cleared you in September." He wasn't wrong about the timeline. He was wrong about everything else. "Where exactly do you think I should go?" I asked. I kept my voice even. I had spent 34 years in corporate management. I knew how to keep my voice even. "Back to Sarasota," Derek said. "Your house is there. Your friends are there. Over the holiday weekend. I know the timing isn't ideal. It's Thanksgiving." "Derek." He shrugged. One shoulder. Like I'd pointed out a minor scheduling inconvenience. "We already have plans. Renee's friend from college is coming. And her husband. And honestly, the house is going to be crowded enough." I sat with that for a moment. 4 months of grocery runs and school pickups and unclogging their kitchen drain and fixing their garbage disposal and listening to Derek talk about his career ambitions over dinner, and I was being asked to leave so there'd be room for Renee's college friend. "All right," I said. Derek looked slightly surprised. He'd probably prepared for more resistance. "I'll be out by Friday morning," I said. Renee finally looked up. There was something in her eyes that must have been guilt, or might have been relief, and I found I didn't want to know which one it was. Not right then. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the guest bed, and I looked at the wall for a while. Then I picked up my phone and called my oldest friend in the world, a man named Gary Sutton, who had known me since we were both 23 years old and working the same miserable entry-level job at a logistics firm in Atlanta. "Tell me everything," Gary said, because that was how Gary answered the phone when he saw my name. I told him. There was a long pause. "Does Derek know?" Gary asked. "No," I said. "Does Renee know?" "She knows some of it. Not the recent part." Another pause. Then Gary laughed, not a mean laugh, but the laugh of a man who can already see how the story ends and finds the irony genuinely delightful. "Robert," he said, "you are going to be just fine." I knew that. I had known that from the moment I sat down across from Derek at the dining room table I'd bought them. What I hadn't decided yet was what fine was going to look like. Let me go back a little, because Derek's mistake was not just the eviction. His mistake started much earlier, and it was built on an assumption so large and so comfortable that he had never once thought to question it. Derek believed I was a retired middle manager who had spent his career in mid-level logistics operations, collected a modest pension, owned a paid-off house in Sarasota, and lived carefully on Social Security and savings. That was the version of me that existed in his mind. He had constructed it early in his marriage to Renee, and he had never updated it, because he had never asked. The truth was more complicated. In 1987, when I was 29 years old, I co-founded a small freight coordination company with Gary Sutton and a third partner named Wes Altman, who later sold his share back to us. Gary and I built it over 15 years from a 3-person operation in a rented office in Marietta, Georgia, into a regional logistics firm with clients across the Southeast. In 2003, we sold a majority stake to a national holding company for an amount I prefer not to specify, though I will say it changed the shape of my life permanently. Gary and I retained minority equity and consulting agreements. I stayed on in a management capacity for 6 more years before stepping back, which is what I had always called it, stepping back, not retiring, because I never fully let go. What I had let go of, carefully and quietly over the previous decade, was the appearance of it. My house in Sarasota was modest by choice. I drove a 4-year-old Ford Expedition. I didn't wear a watch that announced itself. When Renee had first brought Derek home at Christmas 13 years ago, a sharp-jawed young man with confident opinions about wine and a habit of talking about his own career in the third quarter of every conversation, I had assessed him quickly and said very little about myself. Derek had filled in the blanks with what he expected. I let him. It wasn't deception. Exactly. It was economy. I didn't volunteer information to people who hadn't earned it. Derek had spent 11 years not earning it. He had spent those 11 years at a regional logistics and supply chain consultancy called Meridian Group, based in Charlotte. He had risen to Senior Director of Client Services. He was, by his own frequent account, on the path to Vice President. He talked about Meridian the way some men talk about their high school sports career, constantly, reverentially, with a certainty that everyone in the room was as interested as he was. 2 years earlier, Gary and I had quietly acquired a controlling interest in Meridian Group through a holding entity. I want to be very clear about the sequence of events, because I need you to understand that what happened next was not planned. I did not move into Derek and Renee's house with the intention of engineering anything. I came because my knee needed time, and because Renee had asked, and because I genuinely believed that 4 or 5 months under the same roof might give Derek and me a chance to build something real. Instead, I watched him speak to my daughter like she was a project manager he was slightly disappointed in. I watched him ignore Cooper's school play because he had a work dinner he later admitted was optional. I watched him make decisions about the family's finances without telling Renee, including a home equity line of credit he'd opened on a house that, and here was a small detail Derek did not know, was technically still co-titled to me, because Renee and I had never properly completed the transfer when she and Derek bought me out 3 years ago. Not deception. Economy. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, after Derek told me to leave, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Gary, which I've already described. The second was to Patricia Holloway, the executive director of Meridian Group, whom I had hired and whom I had known for 9 years. Patricia, I said, I need you to pull Derek Salter's most recent performance review and his current project assignments and send them to my personal email. A brief pause. Of course, Robert. Is there anything specific you're looking for? I'll know it when I see it, I said. I drove to Sarasota on Friday morning, as promised. I didn't make a scene. I hugged Cooper for a long time, longer than usual, and he looked up at me with those 9-year-old eyes and said, "Are you coming back for turkey, Grandpa?" And I said, "Maybe not this year, buddy, but I'll see you soon." That part was hard. I won't pretend it wasn't. Derek watched from the doorway with the expression of a man who believes he has handled a situation well. My house in Sarasota was fine. It was always fine. I had a property manager who kept it up while I was away. And when I walked in, the air smelled clean and the refrigerator was stocked because I'd called ahead, and I stood in my own kitchen and made my own coffee and sat at my own table and opened my laptop. The performance review Patricia had sent was interesting. Derek had been managing a portfolio of 6 client relationships. In the past 18 months, 2 of those clients had quietly flagged concerns about responsiveness and accuracy in his team's reporting. One had already begun exploring alternatives. The internal notes described Derek as strong on relationship optics, inconsistent on deliverables. His direct reports had given him a lower than average score in the anonymous peer review for create psychological safety on the team. None of this surprised me. What did surprise me, and I want to say this honestly, because I am not a man who enjoys finding ammunition, was the expense report irregularities Patricia had flagged in the same folder. 3 client entertainment claims in a 9-month period that listed attendee counts inconsistent with the venue receipts. Not enormous amounts, enough to notice, enough to matter. I sat with that information for a long time. I called Gary again. "How bad is it?" Gary asked. "Not criminal," I said. "Sloppy. Entitled. What do you want to do?" This was the question I had been sitting with since I drove away from Charlotte. What I wanted was complicated. I wanted my daughter to see her husband clearly. I wanted my grandson to have a stable life. I wanted Derek to understand that the world is larger and more interconnected than he had chosen to believe, and that the older man he had dismissed at his Thanksgiving table was not who he thought he was. What I did not want was to blow up my daughter's marriage out of spite. "I want to handle it right," I said. "Then handle it right," Gary said. "You know how." I spent Thanksgiving alone, which was not as sad as it sounds. A neighbor brought over a plate. I watched the game. I called Cooper in the evening, and he told me about the food, and I made him laugh by pretending I was jealous of the stuffing. I did not call Renee. Not yet. On the Monday after the holiday, I flew to Charlotte. I did not go to their house. I went to the Meridian Group offices on South Tryon Street, which I had visited twice before for board meetings, and which Derek had been to thousands of times without ever knowing that the man who sometimes came to visit his wife's father was also, quietly, the man whose signature appeared on the entity documentation that controlled the company where Derek worked. Patricia met me in the conference room on the 14th floor. We went through everything. "I don't want his termination," I said, when we'd reviewed the full picture. "I want a performance improvement plan and a restructuring of his portfolio. Pull the 2 fragile client accounts and assign them to Marcella's team. Then we'll see what he does with a second chance." Patricia was quiet for a moment. She was smart enough to read the personal dimension of the situation without me spelling it out. And the expense irregularities? Document them formally. Give him the opportunity to reconcile and explain. If the explanation is satisfactory, we let it go with a written warning. If it isn't, I paused. Then we handle it the way we'd handle anyone else. "Understood," Patricia said. I flew home to Sarasota that evening. What happened next, I did not witness directly. I heard it later partly from Patricia and partly from Renee, who called me 3 weeks later in a voice that was very different from the voice she'd used when she stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel. The PIP notification went out on a Tuesday. Derek came home that night and told Renee that someone at Meridian was targeting him. "A rival," he said. "Someone who wanted his client relationships." He framed it as politics, as persecution, as the cost of being too good at his job and making the wrong enemies. He did not tell her about the expense report. Renee, to her credit, asked questions. She asked what the PIP specifically said. She asked about the client concerns. She asked about the irregularities. And Derek, who had spent 11 years managing perception rather than reality, gave her the version of events that made him the protagonist. It might have worked. It had probably worked before. But Renee had grown up with me. She had watched me run a business. She knew what a performance improvement plan looked like from the inside, because I had walked her through the management side of one when she was in her 20s and learning her own career, because I believed in teaching my daughter real things. She knew the language. She knew what inconsistent on deliverables meant in plain English. She knew what expense reconciliation requests meant. She called me on a Sunday morning, 3 weeks after Thanksgiving. "Dad," she said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask me," I said. "Do you have any connection to where Derek works?" The pause I took was only a second, but it was honest. "Yes," I said. "I do." Another pause, longer, on her end. "How long?" "Gary and I acquired a stake about 2 years ago. I should have told you earlier. I didn't want it to complicate things." She was quiet for a moment. Not angry, not yet processing. Did you know when you came to stay with us? I knew before that. I didn't come because of it. I came because you asked me and my knee needed time. But you knew. I knew. She exhaled slowly. Derek has no idea. No, I said. He doesn't. Another long silence. Outside my window, a pelican was sitting on the dock with the absolute stillness of a creature who has nothing to prove to anyone. Dad, she said, and her voice was different now, quieter and more careful. What happened to him at work, was that because of what he did? Asking you to leave? This was the question that mattered. This was the question I had been sitting with since November. No, I said. The performance issues were already documented before Thanksgiving. Patricia brought them to my attention after I left. What Derek did to me made me look more carefully at what he was doing at work. But what I found was already there. I didn't create it. Renee made a small sound. The expense concerns are real, I said. I'd like to believe they're sloppiness rather than deliberate dishonesty. That's why he has an opportunity to explain them. Nobody has taken that opportunity away from him. He hasn't told me about any of this, she said quietly. I know. He told me it was politics. I know that too. The conversation went on for a long time after that. I did not tell Renee what to do. I had never told Renee what to do, not since she was old enough to make her own decisions, because that is not how I believed in raising children. I told her what I knew. I answered her questions honestly. When she asked me if I thought Derek had married her for reasons that had anything to do with what he assumed about my finances, I told her I didn't know, and that was the truth. What I did tell her was this: whatever you decide about your marriage is your decision. I will support you through anything. Cooper has a trust in his name that has been growing since he was born, and nothing that happens between you and Derek or between Derek and me will touch it. That's the only thing I want you to know for certain. She cried a little then, not loudly, the way Renee had always cried quietly, like she was trying not to take up too much space with it. I'm sorry I stood there and let him do that, she said, on Thanksgiving, the day before Thanksgiving. I should have said something. You were caught in the middle, I said. You don't have to be sorry for being human. Derek's expense reconciliation meeting with Patricia happened the following week. He was given 2 hours, the receipts, and the documentation, and the opportunity to provide context. He spent the first 40 minutes explaining why the discrepancy was a data entry error. When Patricia pointed out that the pattern appeared across 3 separate reports prepared by Derek himself, he shifted to a different explanation. When that explanation contradicted the first one, he went quiet. He was issued a formal written warning. His title remained the same. His client portfolio had already been partially reassigned, and the official explanation was a departmental restructuring, which was accurate. The PIP continued. I did not enjoy any of this. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's a version of this story where the satisfaction is in the punishment, and that was never what I was after. What I wanted was accuracy. I wanted the reality of Derek's professional performance to be visible in the same way the reality of his behavior at home was visible clearly, without the polish he applied to everything. Whether that changed anything in his marriage was not my decision. What I can tell you is what happened in February. Renee called me on a Saturday morning. She had taken Cooper to her friend's house, she said. She wanted to talk without him in the room. She and Derek had been in couples therapy since December, she told me. There had been more conversations, difficult ones that had apparently involved Derek admitting things he had not previously admitted, including the fact that he had known, early in their relationship, that I had co-founded a company, and that he had made certain assumptions based on that, and that he had subsequently revised those assumptions downward when the visible evidence, the Ford Expedition, the modest house didn't match his expectations, and had felt, on some level, relieved by the revision. That last part I let sit in silence for a moment. He felt relieved, I said, that I had less. He was embarrassed by it later, Renee said. That's what he told the therapist. Whether he was embarrassed or not, I said carefully, is not really the point. No, she said. It isn't. She paused. He asked me to ask you if you'd be willing to come to a session, with us and the therapist. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about Cooper upstairs with his video game, and the dining room table, and the one-shouldered shrug. Yes, I said. I'd be willing to do that. It was not easy. I will not describe it in detail because some conversations belong to the people who are in them. But I sat across from Derek in a therapist's office in Charlotte on a Tuesday morning in February, and we talked for 90 minutes. And I said things I had been thinking for 11 years and had never said, and he said things I had not expected, including some things that made me believe, against my earlier judgment, that there was something real under the performance. Whether that belief turns out to be right, I don't know yet. That part of the story is still being written. What I know is that I walked out of that building into a cold February afternoon, and I called Gary on the way to my rental car, and Gary said, "Tell me everything." And I did, and when I was done, he was quiet for a moment. "So what now?" he asked. "Now we see," I said. "Robert," Gary said, in the way he had been saying my name for 40 years, with the particular weight of a man who has watched you make decisions both good and bad, and is still here anyway. "You did it right." "I tried," I said. "Cooper called me that evening from Renee's phone. He wanted to know if I was coming to his spring soccer games. I told him I was planning on it. He told me that his team was probably going to win the league this year, because they had a really good midfielder named Josh. "I'll be there for every game I can make," I said. "Even away games?" "Even away games." He made a sound of pure satisfaction, that uncomplicated sound that only 9-year-olds can produce, and said, "Cool," and handed the phone back to his mother. Renee said goodnight. I drove back to my hotel. I sat at the desk by the window and looked out at Charlotte at night, the grid of lights that Derek had navigated for 11 years with the confidence of a man who believed he understood the landscape, and I thought about what it costs to see people only as what they appear to be. Then I opened my laptop and wrote Gary a note about the Meridian Q2 strategy review, because there was work to do, and work was something I had always been good at, and some things don't change. I drove to the airport the next morning early, before the city woke up. The terminal was still quiet, that particular early morning airport quiet, where your footsteps echo and the coffee shops are just turning on their lights. I found a seat at my gate, set my bag down, and looked out the window at the runway. A man my age doesn't expect symmetry. He doesn't expect the account to balance. He learns, over the decades, that most things resolve into ambiguity, not into clean endings or clear lessons, but into the next thing, and then the thing after that. What I had learned from the 4 months in that Charlotte guest room, and the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and everything that came after, was not something new. It was something I had known for a long time, and had chosen to trust even when the evidence ran against it. The truth doesn't need your help. You don't have to force it into the room. It comes on its own, in its own time, through the small cracks in the stories people tell about themselves. All you have to do is be patient and accurate, and willing to be there when it arrives. My flight was called. I picked up my bag. Outside, the first plane of the morning was already moving.